Jesus delighted in telling what seemed to be simple stories that started softly with just a common experience and ended with a bang in a way that his readers would have never imagined. Let's take just a couple of minutes to look at some of the basic format of the way that the parables are laid out and give us a little bit more depth in how a basic format for the parables might look something like this. A story is told about common life experiences. A man goes out to farm, Jesus would often say, and as he looked at his audience, 90% of them were farmers. And so for them, farming was a common experience. If you're from Iowa, that would be a common experience for you as well. If you're from Portland or Seattle, not so much. But for Jesus, he is saying, here's a common experience, a common story, something that you know all happens hundreds of times a day. And as the story goes on, the second thing is that it often contains an unexpected or shocking turn of the events. This is not always there, but if you begin to look for it, you'll often notice that, wait a minute, in the midst of all this common, ordinary stuff, something very unexpected, something shockingly bad or something shockingly wonderful happens. And so there is, from that central shocking point, one central truth which arises. In other words, the point of the story is not that farmers farm, but sometimes something remarkable happens to a farmer, that he stumbles across a pearl of great price. And finally, there is a response from the listener, which is usually implied. Jesus is not just telling stories to tell stories that are fun, but he's telling stories that have a point, that require response, that require obedience from his learners. The story of the foolish builder and the wise builder is not that some builders are wise and some are foolish, but there's a point, there's an application, there's a step to follow through. So when we tackle a parable, when we want to study it, when we want to dig into it, when we want to put it to work for us, we start, as we should with every passage, what does the context hint at the parable's message? Often you get a very good idea what Jesus is trying to say by the parable by the 2 or 3 sentences that happen right before the parable. And then secondly, what can you learn about the common experience? Most of us are not farmers or fishermen, and so those stories about farming and about fishing will require us to do some homework and to dig into our Bible dictionaries or our study Bibles and find out, what exactly is going on here? What would have been the common experience that everyone would have understood about this, the common truths, the unsaid things that Jesus just assumes that we know. And then once we've understood that, often we will find there is a shocking turn of events. Almost always 1, 2 is followed by 3, but when Jesus tells the story, it's 1, 2, and he goes to 16. He skips over, or he changes it, or he twists it, or what usually is a bad thing is glorified as a good thing. And then as we look at that, we come at this point to saying, what is that timeless principle? What is the truth that stands for all time? What is the central message? And it'll be usually just one. That's one thing that makes a parable, is there's one truth that arises out of that main turn of events. And finally, of course, how do we live that out? It's a timeless principle for all time, but for our time, what kind of obedience, what kind of faith, what kind of speaking, what kind of ministry will apply the truth of that parable? So there is the story, for instance. We're not going to use a Lucan one for right now because you will do those later. But there's one in Matthew that's just a really crazy story, and it's of the laborers in the vineyard. Matthew 20, 1-16. I will read it. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the 3rd hour, he saw others standing idle at the marketplace. And he said to them, You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. And so they went. Going out again about the 6th hour, and then the 9th hour he did the same. And even at the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing. And he said, "Why have you been standing idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one hired us." He said to them, "You go into the vineyard too." And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard came and said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those who were hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when those who came first, who had been hired first, came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving that, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who've borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to each one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me to work for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last worker as I gave you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity?" And so the first will be last, and the last will be first. It's a strange story, and when you read it, it just doesn't seem right, too. And if you've heard this several times and you've heard several messages on it, it becomes almost dull. Like, well, yeah, of course, that's the way things work. But we'll see in just a minute, it's really not. But first of all, we want to ask, what themes are introduced by the context? In the verses right before this, we find that they are setting up and they flow in a very deliberate way into the story that Jesus told starting in chapter 20. Verses 19 through 27, "Then Peter said, 'See, we've left everything and followed you. What then will we have?'" You see how that gets echoed out in the parable? "And Jesus said to them, 'Truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you will have followed me, you who have followed me, will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sister, or father, or mother, or children, or lands, for my name's sake, will receive 100-fold, and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out to hire laborers for his vineyard." When we look at this, we find that two themes. Number one, the end of times. That Jesus is starting to focus our mind to say, constantly the way that you live and the way that you work ought to be focused on the fact of eternity, and that eternity will come before very long. Then the idea the first will be last and the last will be first is a theme which comes right before our parable, and it's also the last line in the interpretation or the conclusion to the parable. And finally, there is this question of Peter to say, we've spent all this time, we've worked so hard for you, what are we going to get? With kind of the implication, what are we going to get, and how is it better for the Johnny-come-latelys? And so Jesus is answering this question of Peter and trying to set Peter's mind more towards the eternity and the glory of what they do get, as opposed to the comparison game that is so often played on earth. So what is the common experience? Well, the common experience is working. It doesn't get much more common than working. Now, in this case, it's working out in the vineyard, and we haven't all done that, but most of us have worked, and we've worked for pay. Most of us have worked long hours for not very much pay. In this story, as we do our research, we find that the denarius was a common wage for a day's work. It may be a little bit better than what some would get, but it was fair, and people would have said, okay, they would not even pay any attention to denarius when Jesus mentioned it at the first. Which is what leads us to the shocking turn of events. If the denarius was a little bit better than average pay for a day's work, then when you pay that to people who've only worked for 1 hour, shock starts to set in. Wait a minute, this guy is extravagant. How is a farmer going to survive if he pays a day's wage for only 1 hour of work? But then it gets worse and worse, doesn't it? That every group who's worked more ends up being paid proportionally less per hour. Until we come to that question, we can't believe that you're giving us just a denarius. How could you give us just a denarius when you gave those other guys who worked 1/12 of us the same amount? And of course, out of that shocking turn of events and that question comes the central message. The central message doesn't have anything to do with the people at the 11th hour saying, no one hired us so far. We should not go down the rabbit trail trying to find out who the people who weren't doing the hiring and why people have laid around for 11 hours and not do anything. That's not the point. The point is that Jesus says that God is going to give the same reward to vast groups of people who've worked for varying amounts, answering Peter's question. In other words, the value of living for the Lord is found in that one great eternal prize we have at the end day. And that great eternal prize will be the same eternal prize for each and every person. There is a great equality in the kingdom of God. People may work harder and they may work better, but on a very primal, very basic level, there is a great equality with the way that God gives us. And of course, the last thing we should say in that principle is that what God gives us is not a little bit, but it's generous. Even those first people worked for a little bit better than the average pay. It was generous for them. And somehow they had allowed themselves to be twisted into thinking that God's generosity was just a petty amount because he happened to want to be generous to others. And so how do we live out this principle? Well, you could choose several ways. One is that we can remind ourselves constantly and try to live out in our churches so that there is eternal value seen in each soul. Some may be smarter, some may be prettier, some may be stronger, some may have better singing voices. Others may have great empathy, but the value of each person is exactly the same. We can try to live this out too in the way that I think probably may have been Jesus' primary thought, and that is, rather than comparing what we get with others, we need to rejoice in what we've received from the Master. I was taught as a young man that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And that's true, and I've never come to any thinking that's different than that. But I have learned something else as I've gone along through life, and that is that parables are stories that take a second to love, but a lifetime to understand. As we do a little bit of digging, as we find out the context, and find out what the common experience was like in that day, and as we see some of the strange twists that Jesus gives to the stories, at least some of his stories, we start to find that there's a whole new level of energy, of life, of Jesus' call upon our life in these stories that take a second to love, but a lifetime to understand.